What are some of the stories that feel the most familiar to you? Maybe it's a story of an important historical event. If you're a big history buff, you might be able to recall play by play how an infamous international conflict was resolved, or you might know all the mysterious circumstances behind an important political figure's death. Some of the stories we know are the ones that are the most significant to us in our own lives. Maybe it's how your parents or your grandparents met and fell in love. Maybe it's about how some of these people fell out of love. You might be able to recall some of the stories that happened in your own life like it was yesterday, regardless of how many years have gone by. The stories of life's greatest joys, as well as some of our greatest days of pain and disappointment. Chances are we all have a lot of stories to tell. As we examine the biblical story together this morning, I'm going to invite you to ask yourselves a scary question about some of these stories. Maybe one that you're already wrestling with. What if some of these stories, even the ones we feel that we know the most intimately, aren't as accurate as we always thought they were? What if the narrative that we've repeated, sometimes generation to generation, isn't the most accurate retelling of the real life event? One of my favorite podcasts is an NPR production called This American Life, and I listened to an episode last week that inspired some of my thought process behind this sermon. The episode is titled The Rest of the Story, and it spends an hour talking to different people who, as adults, are faced with some of the less familiar and sometimes less convenient aspects of their own most intimate stories. And it got me to really push myself into looking at my own stories differently. And what a better place to start than with one of the most frequently referenced Bible stories of all time. How many people here are not familiar in some way with the David and Goliath narrative? Nobody, right? You didn't have to go to Sunday school or church as a child. You don't ever have to walk in a church at all, in fact. You could just maybe even watch an American sport for more than an hour, and there's a great likelihood you'll hear some kind of reference to this, right? They'll use it when mentioning two seemingly mismatched teams. You'll hear about the highly ranked Goliath team taking on the low-ranked David team, right? Because that's the way that the story has always been told. The great underdog, the young and unassuming David, does the impossible and defeats the great warrior giant. Now, you might see where I'm going with this by now, but there is actually a lot more to this story than that. The Israelites are at war with the Philistines, and the Philistines were a much more powerful army than Israel. They had better trained soldiers, and they were engaged in this conflict that was going to likely cost Israel many, many lives. But in this moment in the story, the two sides have kind of hit an impasse. They're both each on opposite sides of a ravine, and so either side coming down to attack the other leaves that side in a very vulnerable position. So neither side wants to go, and so they're kind of in a stalemate. And so the solution that the Philistines come up with for solving this stalemate is they say, okay, we're going to solve this whole conflict, this whole war, with one battle. One person versus another. Choose your fighter. Each side must send a warrior to fight on behalf of the whole army, and the person who comes out of it alive claims victory for themselves and for their entire nation. And the Philistines choose Goliath. And from how he's described in the text, I think he's the guy you want fighting for you. He's this giant of a person. He comes out covered in layers of heavy armor, and he is ready and eager to fight anyone. For days, no one on Israel's side is willing to fight this giant of a figure who comes out every morning daring the Israelites, daring to send one of them to come fight him. No one's willing to take the bait until David finally steps up to the plate. David is described here as this young, small, simple shepherd. He comes to fight with no heavy armor. He has no formal combat training. He just has a slingshot and a sack of stones. Common sense would tell you that there's no way this can end well for David and the Israelites, right? Well, I think most of us know the answer to that question. They meet each other in battle. Goliath is outraged, and he is so offended that the Israelites would insult him in this way by sending this small, unassuming person that doesn't anywhere compare to him in stature or experience. Goliath, the man who sends shivers down the spines of entire armies, can't fathom how the opposing side could send this small shepherd with no armor on at all. It says that King Saul attempts to clothe David in his own armor, and he's so uncomfortable, so not used to it, that he just decides to go just himself. But as we know, he doesn't need it, because all it ends up taking is a single slingshot to the forehead, and Goliath is knocked to the ground and defeated. The Israelites win. A true underdog story and a totally inexplicable miracle. End of the story, right? Well, David is not quite as much of an underdog as we've always made him out to be. Sure, on the surface, it would seem like he had no business in this battle. How could this boy think he could have any chance at defeating one of the world's biggest and most experienced warriors? Well, as ridiculous as it seems for someone to show up to battle with no armor and a small slingshot as their only weapon, this happened a lot more often in ancient battles than I originally realized. This story is a little more complex than just little guy somehow defeats the big guy narrative. Author Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book about the David and Goliath phenomenon and our tendency to see this battle as this binary force of power versus weakness. Gladwell points out that Goliath is just one type of warrior in a militaristic system that would have had many different types of warriors and strategies of combat that would have worked best in any given situation. There were the hand-to-hand combat warriors like Goliath, who were classically very big and strong and showed up to battle in all the heavy and extensive armor. But there were also, among others, people known as slingers. People who used slingshots to fling rocks and sometimes heavy lead balls into the faces of their enemies from long range. These fighters would move quickly through battle with little to no armor. In fact, David refuses Saul's armor not only because it's uncomfortable, because it's not necessary. If anything, it would have slowed him down. Slingers, according to Gladwell, were a force to be reckoned with. It took extraordinary skill and practice to be one, and we can think David maybe had a little bit of experience because he talks about slaying the lion and the bear as he's protecting his flock as a shepherd. It required incredible accuracy and precision to hit moving targets from a long distance. But given the right shot, it could be a devastating weapon. It's said, according to Gladwell, that a slinger could seriously injure or kill a target from up to 200 yards away. Slingers as a weapon of warfare were known to decimate entire armies. In fact, and this is a little bit of a morbid fact here, this happened so often that the Romans actually created a special pair of tongs specifically made to pry stones and heavy balls out of the foreheads of their fallen soldiers. And while slingers were not 100% accurate with every shot, they had an especially hard time hitting those fast-moving targets in the battlefield. There were certain types of warriors that they were pretty deadly accurate in hitting. It was those soldiers used to fight in hand-to-hand combat, ones who wore heavy armor and couldn't move very quickly. These soldiers were typically sitting ducks for a slinger's shot. Goliath, standing at such a great height, as it's described in the text, in his layers of heavy armor, would have been a really easy target. All this goes to say, the story that we thought we knew so well, maybe we don't really know it as well as we thought we did. Goliath is not the invincible warrior that we knew him to be. Neither is David the humble novice shepherd that we've always thought of him as. There are so many stories that we tell that do not fully represent the truth that we seek to know. They leave out context, they muddy the facts and the details, and they exclude important voices. What do we miss when we don't hear the whole story? There's probably lots of stories that you've heard at one point in your life that you realize later on, maybe those weren't really painting the whole picture. I can think of this on a big scale, like stories in the world, historical events, and in our own lives, in our families, in our groups of friends. One thing that comes up to mind for me is like thinking back to my elementary school class, happily reenacting the first Thanksgiving meal, right? I think I came to learn later as an adult that it did not quite happen the way that we reenacted it in kindergarten. Speaking of not getting the full story in school, how many of us felt like we were accurately taught about our country's history and its participation in systems like slavery and Jim Crow and its ongoing participation in patterns of systemic racism? Right? Nobody? This week we commemorated the 22nd anniversary of the 9/11 attacks that happened right here in New York City. I was still very young when the attacks happened, and also when we quickly declared war on other countries in the aftermath. And sadly, we would all come to find out years later that some of those reasons for going to war were a little more complicated. There was a little more to that story than what we had originally been told and what we knew. It was a little bit more than just fighting for our freedom. Why is it important for us to get all the facts straight? Why would God call us to seek out the full story with all perspectives taken into account? Some of those answers might feel obvious. It's important to know what really happened in the stories that we've told throughout history, because when we don't know the whole story, we tend to repeat the same mistakes over and over and over and over again. As for our own personal lives, knowing the whole story can be a challenging and sometimes painful process. It might mean having to go back and think through past relationships and realizing that maybe we had a greater hand in their downfall than we'd like to admit. It might mean having to let go of that anger and disappointment that we feel towards that former partner, that former friend, coworker, family member, and recognizing that we have a shared and flawed humanity with some of these individuals. And in the same way, revisiting our old narratives might also allow us to give ourselves grace and compassion. Retelling the whole story with the whole truth included, it might force us to unburden ourselves of guilt, regret, and shame that was never ours to carry in the first place. It may force us to look back on some of those experiences from our youth, from earlier on in our lives, and look at these former relationships and finally realize that there was nothing more of ourselves that we could have given that could have made the outcome any different. There are even implications to the way that we've misunderstood the David and Goliath story that we've talked about today. What harm could come from seeing this battle, seeing it as just a battle of these two opposing sides, giant versus little guy, favorite versus underdog? Well, I don't know about you all, but I was always taught to look at this story more from the David lens, to see myself as that character, the little guy always facing giants with the odds stacked against me. I think a lot of us here who commit ourselves to justice work and care about the overall well-being and fate of humanity, we've probably felt this way. In a world of political corruption, corporate greed, and systemic oppression, it is easy to feel like those of us who seek to make a positive impact in the world are constantly showing up to battle with nearly impossible odds against us. On a smaller scale, some of you all might feel like the underdogs maybe in your workplaces or in your family systems, fighting against negative and toxic cultures that have been around much, much longer than you have. But now that we know the whole story, we can realize that we're not as much of an underdog as we thought. We're not ill-equipped for battle, we're just trained to fight differently. In the same way that David didn't need heavy armor or fancy weapons to defeat Goliath, we don't need to use the giant's weapons in fighting the giants in our lives. It was Audre Lorde who said it best, that the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. We don't need to fight greed with more greed or hate with more hate. We fight different. Knowing the whole story here can inspire us to show up to all of life's greatest battles, equipped in the ways that best suit our own skills and experiences. From the creation story to the building of the ark, all the way to Jesus' birth, death, and resurrection, God has gifted us with many powerful stories. The way we tell, retell, and interpret these stories is so crucial, just like it is in the ongoing story that is each one of our lives. Storytelling is one of the most powerful art forms that God gives to us, and I pray that each one of you are given wisdom and guidance to see your stories more fully, to take accountability when it's necessary, to be challenged and pushed to grow, but also to have compassion for yourselves and have compassion for some of these people who make an appearance in your narrative. I pray that you are able to see yourself and others in the full beauty and contradiction of who we are. Hero and villain, wrong and wronged, underdog and favorite. May the presence, love, and comfort of God go with you as your story continues to unfold. Amen.